Hey.
We'll start the other way around. We'll start with the book.
Okay.
Why'd you write a book?
I wasn't going to write it, and I got nudged by the editor of my second nonfiction book and still said no. But the more I thought about it, the farther I got from the actual work of government, the more I thought, I'll give it a shot. And so I tried it with a lot of help from my amazing spouse, who you know, Patrice, and I found it addictive and loved it. It's what I want to do when I grow up now.
Well, I can't help but think that if you hadn't been fired by Donald Trump, you'd just be, I think, finishing your 10th year as FBI director. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd have 3 months to go. I'd be 5'6".
Do you feel like a sliding doors existence about that? Do you know that movie with Gwyneth Paltrow?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, sometimes. I often think, so what would I be like? What would my family be like if I had stayed 6 more years? And in a way, I grieve that miss. And in a way, I feel incredibly lucky that I've gotten to do what I've done over the last 6 years. So I'm not sure where I end up on that.
I mean, I guess I see it from the country's perspective, and I wonder if there's anything that you might have done differently.
Done differently?
Than the people who've been running the FBI since you left.
Yeah, I'm sure I would have done a lot differently in the sense that because the director wouldn't have been fired before me. I think a lot of what Chris Wray has done, he's a person of deep principle, is an effort to protect the institution by not getting fired. I mean, I was surprised he was quiet after January 6th. And I don't know, because I'm not in touch with him and haven't been since I was fired, but I had to imagine he was doing that on purpose so that Trump wouldn't have an excuse to fire him and put in someone truly dangerous for the last 2 weeks of the Trump administration. And so it's hard to judge how he's conducted himself because he's following someone who got fired.
But can you protect the country if you're trying to not get fired?
Well, maybe if not getting fired is protecting the country. I mean, you saw some of the people who Donald Trump tried to put in at CIA and as the director of national intelligence. If he'd been able to put someone like that in at FBI, wow, I don't know what would have happened. So I think Chris may have been protecting by that move. Now, I may have some differences on whether he ought to be, now that he's under Joe Biden as president, ought to be speaking out a little bit more. But at least for the Trump term, I think I can get it.
One of the things he did speak out about under oath, he testified in September of 2020 that the greatest threat to the homeland was domestic violent extremism. And in that bucket, by far, the greatest number of extremists were ones who adhered to white supremacy. Fast forward to January 6th, and not just a massive domestic terrorism attack, but one with the mission statement of hanging Mike Pence. What do we do as a country when the political party that doesn't include all white supremacists or all extremists, but all white supremacists and extremists seem to prefer Republicans to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? What do we do if the party won't purge those extremists from it as a country?
Well, we just have to first stare at that reality, know that it's a reality, and use all of the lawful tools and resources available to us. The FBI in particular has a lot of tools to try and understand the threat and disrupt the threat. And that's tricky for the FBI because it's a risk-averse agency to begin with. It really is a rule-following culture for good reason, born of a real trauma 50 years ago with the exposure of FBI abuses, especially directed at civil rights leadership. And so it's people who don't want to get in trouble, and they stare at the controversy, right, the wind blowing at anyone from these Republican committees especially, and I think it pushes the FBI into a bit of a defensive crouch. That's where leadership is needed. That's where the director has to speak, maybe not externally, but internally, and say, look, let me tell you all why these cases on January 6th, for example, matter so much. It's core to our mission of sending deterrence messages. But I don't think that's happening, and I'm not sure why.
Harry Dunn, one of the Capitol police officers who protected the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, in actually the first public hearing of the January 6th Select Committee, pleaded really with Congress to not just track down the hitman, but to go find the people who sent the hitman. Do you have any doubt in your mind who that person is?
No, and I hope, again, I can't see from the outside, but I sure would hope his conduct, I assume you mean Donald Trump, that's who I mean. that Donald Trump's
Be wild.
yeah, that Donald Trump's
Be there.
conduct,
I mean, I think he did it on Twitter.
yeah, I don't know whether it adds up to a prosecutable incitement case or a seditious conspiracy case, but it's sure worth a really close look. And I don't know whether it was being done before Jack Smith was made special counsel. I guess I don't know for sure that it's being done now, but I think it's a reasonable assumption.
I want to turn to the novel because the novel is great. I got to read it about a year ago, and it's great. But so much of it is this grayness. And so I want to try to nail you down on your views about the limits of the rule of law, because I think what a lot of people are contending with is Mitch McConnell probably sees a lot of these Trump questions the same way normal people do, but because of his grip on the power in the Republican Party, won't say it. And I think a lot of people feel exasperated that the plea of a Harry Dunn to go find the person who sent the hitman, which I think means the foot soldiers on January 6th, there's no public-facing evidence that that includes Trump. And we know what Trump looks like when he's being scrutinized. He doesn't stop screaming for people to be fired. He asks for meetings with Merrick Garland, and that's very clear that the documents case is very much scrutinizing Donald Trump. If his actions are not prosecutable around January 6th, why do you think a congressional committee referred 4 crimes?
Well, I don't know that the standard is the same. I think they saw, I forget what their exact...
Obstruction of an official proceeding, insurrection.
Yeah, I would say I don't know what
fraud.
the threshold, evidentiary threshold they think of when they decide what to refer. It's certainly not as high as conviction beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 who must agree unanimously. And so I think they see maybe even probable cause level, and so refer it. Makes sense, but it doesn't tell me that it's going to result in a prosecutable criminal case.
When the public hears a former federal judge in California say it's more likely than not that Donald Trump and John Eastman committed felonies, and Liz Cheney, a conservative, I had the privilege of defending her father when he shot his best friend in the face. I mean, I know Cheney conservatism like I know anything. And to have Liz Cheney say, if Donald Trump isn't prosecuted, then there is no rule of law in America, what does that do inside the department? What kind of pressure, if any?
Well, I hope it puts a significant pressure on the department, because the department is a risk-averse organization,
Clearly.
too. And so there's a risk that it would also get into a bit of a clinch and say, we don't want to take this swing, which is why I think the case brought here in Manhattan is significant, because it crosses a cultural Rubicon that, without even people being able to articulate it, people I think in DC feel freer now to bring a case, is my guess.
They'd be second. They'd be the second.
Yeah, they'd be second.
Right.
But there really is this sense that we'd be the first to ever do this, and it changes the picture when someone's done it. But look, I think that pressure is important. Now, that's also not to say that there is a prosecutable case. I mean, it's really hard to see from the outside, and you do a great job of covering these things, but I also know from having been on the inside of investigations, the media never quite has the picture that you have on the inside, for good reason. And so I don't know where it'll end up. It really turns on proving beyond a reasonable doubt the content of Donald Trump's mind. And I mean this to be wise-ass, but also true. I'm not even sure he knows what's in his mind at any given moment. And so proving that, you've said this, his chaotic statements, well, he's self-exculpating in a lot of the ways by saying...
That's like the stupidity defense. I mean, that's why nothing ever happens.
Well, but no, I don't know. It's a stupidity defense. It means, can I get a clean
Insanity,
shot?
Twinkie, I mean, what do you call it?
Well, I have to convince a jury of 12 that we've proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he was aware of the unlawful nature of his conduct. And
you don't think Cipollone and Mark Meadows walking in there and saying, we should tell them to go home, and him saying no until 7 o'clock at night is...
Sure, maybe. I mean, again, I don't want to be making an argument for Donald Trump, but I would imagine in the chaos that is his brain and was his presidency, there are other balls bouncing around there that are arguably exculpatory.
When you said, Lordy, I hope there are tapes, it had a meaning at the time, and I think as time wore on, it took on a different one. When you watch the difficulty of nailing Trump down, absent tapes, he doesn't email, the people around him seem just as willing to lie than tell the truth, even when under scrutiny, because of the free-flowing pardon practice of the Trump White House. What do you think about the fact that all these years later, no one has held him accountable for anything? And he, right now, as we all sit here, is the current frontrunner for the Republican nomination in a deeply divided country.
It reminds me in a weird way of Joe Gambino, who was the founder of the Gambino crime family.
Now we're talking.
Well, no, the founder of the Gambino crime family died a free man because he only talked about family business, capital F, outdoors to two people and only when whispering. And so how do you make that case? In a weird way, Donald Trump is an analog to that because he speaks so much, so often, in so many contradictory ways that it's almost the functional equivalent of a noise machine that obscures the truth, right? You turn on that white noise machine, the white noise is coming out of his mouth constantly, and he's being told, take the election, right? He's being told by, I'm about to refer to Bill Barr as an authoritative source, but what the heck? He's being told by Bill Barr, this is all bullshit. But he's also being told by a bunch of wingnuts that there's a lot to this. The pillow guy's telling him, other people are telling him. And so that's exculpatory. That noise makes it very hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 that you've met the threshold. And so that's what makes the Mar-a-Lago case so dangerous for him.
Well, you brought Bill Barr into our little gathering, so we'll let him stay here for a minute. Bill Barr, do not get between Bill Barr and a camera when he wants to tell you how much deep, what Trump is in when it comes to Mar-a-Lago. Why is he so convinced that he's going to be charged?
I'm not sure. Bill and I aren't in touch.
Me neither.
So I don't know. I'm guessing it's some version of the reason I think that it's a confined factual universe, both literally confined into Mar-a-Lago, and confined in time and in concept, and it's susceptible of clear proof. Someone saying, the documents were here, he told me this, and so I moved them there, and I told him, I'm making this up, but I told him about the subpoena, and so it's potentially a very clean shot at Donald Trump in a way that Georgia isn't, in a way that the January 6th case isn't.
Why are the election cases so difficult to charge and bring? I mean, Donald Trump tweeted all of the things that we're learning took place behind closed doors. Donald Trump was told of the threats to the vice president. I worked for a president. He didn't run anywhere ever. I mean, Mike Pence was running down the stairs of the Capitol. Without turning the results in half a dozen states, he doesn't get to stay in power, which is clearly his plan. Why is it so difficult to assemble proof of a conspiracy to defraud the electorate?
I think, again, because there's lots of conversations that I could imagine cut the other way. Him being told by, I'm forgetting the guy from Chapman. Eastman. Told by people like Eastman, no, you have a real case here. It's lawful. There's a lawful mechanism under the Constitution to do this or that. Being told by the woman whose name, I keep blocking these names out, the Kraken lady.
Cindy Powell.
Here's a member of the bar, right? A former prosecutor. Trump could say, yes, I know what Pat Cipollone said or Barr said, but she told me this. And so that chaos, that agency of chaos, in a way makes him as hard to get as Gambino.
So Gambino and the mob are sort of a hang-up, right? It ties together. I think one of your first interviews when you wrote about your Trump experience was with George Stephanopoulos, and you describe I think it's your first meeting with him during the transition. You come up here, and it's when the practice of these contemporaneous memos of your interactions with Trump, I think that's the first one, right?
Yeah, first one I ever wrote.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the first thing you write down is that it was like meeting with
a mafia boss. Yeah, it was Clapper, so Director Clapper, Director Brennan, Director Rogers from NSA, and myself went to Trump Tower, and I had a chance because I wasn't doing all the speaking. Clapper was doing a lot, and Brennan to just watch, and I kept having this weird image pop in my head of a Cosa Nostra boss, and I kept pushing it away, having a conversation with myself when I should be paying attention. But I was saying to myself, you're being dramatic. What is wrong with you? You're not dramatic. Why are you being dramatic? Stop that. And so I suppressed it, and then it just kept coming back and coming back. And I realize now in hindsight, I was perceiving something real. The way he spoke, the way he interacted with his staff, it's all mafia bosses, the entire family centers right here. It's all on me. What can you do for me? How can you serve me? And it's that same vibe that I was picking up, and so it wasn't overly dramatic in hindsight.
Do you ever think about the decisions that you made in the final days of the election in a different way? I asked you this today on the air, but do they, and I'm not asking if you regret what you did. I think I understand you and your sort of code and the way you led the FBI according to that code. But do you look at the fallout and the fact that this person you just described feeling in your gut most closely resembled a mobster? This is America's this is America's president-elect, and you're sitting in a room silently. One of the things I think you have to do is tell him about the PP tape, right? Which he loses his mind over. I mean, this is the beginning of your interactions with the 45th president of the United States of America. Does any of what comes next, not just for you, leaving in year, 3 of a 10-year term that you should still be in if none of this had happened, does it make you feel worse about the way the 2016 campaign ended?
Sure, a lot. I mean, it deepens the pain of that whole experience. And I've thought about it a lot, as you might imagine. And I've often fantasized, if I could go back in time, I thought then, and I still think now, it would be deeply inappropriate for the FBI director to make a decision based on his judgment of who should be president of the United States. But I've often wondered, in a time travel world, if I went back, would I do that deeply inappropriate thing in service to my country? And I don't know. But even though I think that way, of course, I mean, the idea that I was trying to help elect Donald Trump president is just the farthest thing from my mind. But I was also trying to make a decision without regard to that judgment. Because as I said to you today, you don't want the FBI director making decisions on that basis, because someday you're really not going to like the judgment that director makes. And look, I forget how many people voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but another director might have said, you know what? Donald Trump would be a better president than Hillary Clinton, and so I'm going to make this decision. So I really couldn't. But yeah, of course, I've thought about it a ton, because I think he did grievous damage. And it causes me pain that I might have been part of causing that to happen. Now, I didn't get to say this to you during our interview. 2020 gives me some consolation, because the polls tightened in the same way. All the late-breaking voters broke for Trump in the same way in 2020. And I was home in my pajamas. And so I'd love...
Stay awake this time?
Yeah. I'd love some academic to do the study and prove that in light of 2020, if you compare it to 2016, the same thing happened. The FBI had nothing to do with it. But honestly, as I've told you before, I was making a decision assuming that we might have an impact. And so assuming that, which of these two doors is the one most consistent with this institution's values? And people can see it differently. But looking at what happened with Donald Trump, yeah, it just makes it even more painful. I wish to God we hadn't been involved, but I wish that at the moment. And I could see the future. I hadn't yet talked to him about the P tape and all that, but I listened to him talking about grabbing women by their private parts.
Stands by it.
And so, right, what do you say, fortunately or unfortunately?
Fortunately or unfortunately, for 1 million years, yeah.
So I knew what this person was, but I think, and I still do actually, I still do, even as painful as it is, that decision can't be made in any part based on who I think should be the president as the FBI director.
One of the things that I think the constant re-examination of this period coughs up is this question of why the Russia investigation into the Trump campaign was treated differently, why you didn't feel the compunction to be public about that. What's the explanation, the easiest way to understand that?
Because we had just started it. We didn't talk about the Clinton investigation for a year. And because there was nothing to talk about, we didn't know, and we only talked about it at the end, what we thought was the end, and we said, done well, there's no there, Republicans, I'll fight you all day long, there's no there. The Russia investigation, we knew for sure the Russians were interfering. What we didn't know was, were any Americans working with them? We actually, you know this, we didn't open on Trump, but we had smoke around 4 other people, and so we opened on them, not knowing whether there was any there. And so it actually never occurred to us. I don't remember a single conversation about saying something publicly, in part because what would we say? Right? We're looking at Americans, we can't tell you who, it's not Trump, but we don't know. And so we did it the same way we did the Clinton investigation, until we knew. And then we talked about it. I confirmed this investigation in March, actually earlier, I think, than we confirmed the Clinton investigation. And so we treated them according to the same principles.
So you're saying that the parallel is in the maturity of the investigations.
Correct. And who it involved. I mean, Hillary Clinton was the subject of the investigation into whether she mishandled classified information. Donald Trump was not the subject until I got fired and they opened an obstruction case on him. He was not the subject of an FBI investigation. He wanted me to tell the world that.
Yeah, I know.
And,
I remember that from the last book, yeah.
I wouldn't, for among other reasons, it creates the mother of all duties to correct.
Well, I guess my question on that is, so he's running again. His current position on Russia is that he'd end the war in a day, and senior military people think that means that he'd give Ukraine back to Putin.
That's the way I understand that.
I mean, do you feel like the questions and the investigation that was open, did it ever run its completion? Do you think the nation's questions have been answered about Trump's affinity for Putin?
No, and here's something that you don't miss this, but a lot of media misses this. The counterintelligence investigation was never completed, as far as I understand. We were conducting a counterintelligence investigation, which is about collecting evidence, but also intelligence and information to try and understand a threat without regard to whether you can prosecute it, because once you understand who's working with the Russians, you can figure out how do we stop that. Mueller picked up the criminal case. And I think Mueller assumed that the FBI was going to continue to conduct the counterintelligence investigation, try and understand who might have a relationship with the Russians and why. As far as I know, that work stopped when Mueller was appointed. So I don't know that the work was ever finished. Again, to try and understand, why is Donald Trump this way? Why does he speak this way about Vladimir Putin? What is it about the relationships that raise an intelligence concern? Now, I'm guessing they made a decision we can't conduct an intelligence investigation of the president. I don't know that, but I'm fairly confident the work was never done. So I can't answer that, and I bet you today, unless they've picked it up since, the FBI can't answer that.
Well, if you're trying to not get fired, I can't imagine that's something that this FBI leader has picked up.
I don't know.
I mean, and again, why it matters is Ron DeSantis has described the war, an illegal invasion of Ukraine by an American adversary and clearly a Ukrainian adversary, as a territorial dispute. Trump's views on Russia have now infected one of the two major political parties in the country.
It doesn't seem to have fully infected the Republican cult, but it...
30 Republicans voted against military. I mean, I think
not fully, but
well, Biden is not reelected. I think most Ukrainians feel that American aid for their war will not continue. Is that fair?
It's fair to really worry about that, for sure.
So all of this feels like it plays out in some of the gray. I mean, I think this book is so gripping because the tension never ends. There's not a happy, I don't want to give it away, but you're along the ride with this complicated, committed, female, strong, I mean, a strong female lead is what keeps coming to mind, but she's not Pollyannish, and I wonder if your real life experience, cutting off your term as 10-year FBI director, some of that pain plays out in these pages. It feels like it.
Yeah, I think it does. But I had a sense of the darkness before then, that I think just intersections with people and cases. I started out in 1987 as a federal prosecutor. I worked for a guy named Rudy Giuliani, who seemed different then. And
you don't say.
You would probably say the same about me. And that I think starting in 87, I started to realize that the justice system is imperfect in lots of different ways. Obviously, it's imperfect because innocent people get convicted, because human bias, especially confirmation bias, is a part of the criminal justice system, but that it's also imperfect because there's a difference between truth and justice, that there are things you can know in your heart of hearts that a bad person did a bad thing, and the most painful are the ones involving children, innocent victims, where you know that guy. In your heart of heart, I know that guy's a serial killer, but I can't prove it because justice sets a threshold that's above that. And so I hit a lot of those cases early on. So that sense of that there's a difference between truth and justice grows. And then I had the chance to be a defense lawyer and a general counsel, and I saw gray and had to make judgments in gray, which I can't talk about because I was a private lawyer. But I came to understand that these questions are rarely as simple as they seem, and there's a lot of gray in life. And so I've tried to reflect that there.
Some of the deepest relationships in her life and some of the things you bring to life are the relationships between prosecutors and investigators. These are sort of two maligned groups by Donald Trump and all Republicans. But it is a reminder that behind the Fox segments and behind the political swipes are human beings trying to do the right thing. Do you want to talk about how you crafted these characters and their relationships with each other? And they're more than work colleagues or office mates. They become a family.
Yeah, and that's my lived experience in two respects. Investigators and prosecutors are overwhelmingly good people trying to do the right thing. Overwhelmingly. Now, overwhelming isn't all. Of course, there's going to be people who bring shame on the business of law enforcement, but they're almost all people who are just trying to get it right. And they're under tremendous pressure. And so that creates the second aspect, which is really a sense of family, that you're in a foxhole together trying to do hard things, and it bonds them. Some lifelong closest relationships were with people I investigated cases with when I was a prosecutor. And so I've tried to capture that sense of family there because it's real. And one of the things I've tried to do with this book that I hope you all read it, you see to be true, is I'm told that in a lot of crime fiction, and I haven't read a ton of crime fiction because I always had a hard time reading it. Anything about—
What bugs you? It's like, oh, that wouldn't really happen like that.
Just my days were filled with
Yeah.
crime and terrorism and espionage, and really I'm going to open a book
And read
on
it
my
more?
vacation and read, oh, this guy's going to kill these innocent people. How great is this? And so so I'm not an expert on crime fiction, but I'm told that a lot of it generates excitement by having prosecutors or investigators go rogue, break the law in service of some greater good. And I haven't done that because it's really freaking exciting when they're following the rules. I mean, the work is incredible. And so I've tried to paint an accurate picture that I think maintains the excitement. And it's the truth that I lived. And so there's no perfect people in this book. They're complicated people, all a combination of good and bad, all flawed like I am, but they're really trying to get it right, and that brings them together in cool and deep ways.
I mean, I think what's impossible to understand outside of that world is how much you rely on your witnesses. And when you're prosecuting a mob family, some of your witnesses are mobsters. I've thought about this specific story, sometimes covering Trump, and when people say, oh, Michael Cohen has no credibility, I'm like, well, of course he does. He was inside the Trump administration. 47,000 people have interviewed him 50,000 times. I mean, the idea that your fictional characters could prosecute the fictional mobsters without relying on fictional mobsters is ludicrous. Can you just explain how you prosecute mobsters?
Yeah, so how do you do it? How do you make the case against someone who surrounds himself with murderers, thieves, extortionists, really horrible people, without having horrible people as your witnesses? And we're forever—
Who did the horrible things and were in the room when the horrible things were happening.
We're forever. I could actually picture jury addresses I've given where we say, look, I'd love it if we could call some revered faith leader in here to tell you about the meeting they had about whacking this guy. But he doesn't have meetings with faith leaders about whacking guys, right? And the other argument we would make is, yeah, they're bad people. They're not my friend. They're his friend. I mean, I didn't pick these people as my friends, but it's a real challenge. And this is another way in which, thank you for asking this question, another way in which Donald Trump reminds me of a mob boss. Credible people of integrity are not attracted to working for Donald Trump. And so if you get to his inner circle, what are you going to find there?
The pillow guy.
Yeah, you're going to find the pillow guy and the hair makeup running down the cheeks and whatnot.
Rudy.
I mean,
the wind lady. I mean, but this is why people say you can't prosecute Trump. The only people in the room at the end were the pillow guy and Mike Flynn. Well, that's not my fault. I mean, go ask the pillow guy.
Right, and that's the argument that Jack Smith would have to make to a jury.
Yeah.
You can see the danger here, but they'd have to say, I don't want the pillow guy as a witness, but I don't know whether the pillow guy would flip.
I don't either.
If the pillow guy flipped,
there's the other guy, the Overstock guy.
I mean, all of them are people with significant issues that would be subject to impeachment. And so Michael Cohen is a difficult witness to put on the witness stand. Now, he appears to be forthcoming and saying, yeah, I lied a lot. Well, you just admitted you lied under oath, and now we're presenting you to a jury and asking them to believe you when you're testifying on oath because you say, this time you're really not lying. So there's a obvious reason that criminal leaders are surrounded by other criminals. And in a way, it's a comfort to them because they know none of these people could rat me out. It's one of the reasons that my favorite part of The Wire is when Stringer Bell says,
don't take any notes, it's a criminal conspiracy.
Right, he says it's a fucking criminal conspiracy. Don't take notes. Well,
I quote it once a week because I ever was looking for the January 6th coup plot, and I said there was someone as smart as Stringer Bell in the room.
Because even if Michael Cohen has a tape, or he wrote something down, or even the pillow guy made contemporaneous notes, or has Lordy, there's a tape of the pillow guy, then that's strong corroboration and makes it possible for that flawed human to be a witness without being subject to devastating impeachment in the same way. Prosecutors are always looking to corroborate their witnesses. And I once had a witness asked on the stand, a mob witness, what do you think corroboration means? And he was not an educated person, but he said, I think it's when the evidence crosses over. He's right. And so finding evidence to cross over, sometimes it's multiple terrible people crossing together, or sometimes it's a document, a tape, something that can't be impeached in the same way. But I don't know whether that's there in the January 6th case. I don't know whether it's there in the work that's being done, because I can't tell.
You've mentioned Michael Cohen a couple times, and I've interviewed him a few times, and I have to say that what he would say is that Alvin Bragg's sort of revitalized look at the Vance-Pomerantz case involved what you're describing, this process of corroboration. And if you look at all the witnesses that went in, they seem to be people who might have been able to corroborate that account of hush money, which, again, the thing about Trump, and you know this better than I do, is much of what he says and does is not a secret. What do you make of the strength of Alvin Bragg's case?
I can't tell. I mean, I've read the indictment and the statement of facts. It looks to me to be an appropriate case to bring. How he'll do a trial, I don't know. What I feel good about it because it's a great opportunity for the American people to see what the rule of law looks like. Right? A prosecutor goes to the grand jury, an indictment's returned, it's returned in open court, there's going to be discovery, the defendant has to sit there. This is what it looks like, this thing that Donald Trump has tried to take a flamethrower to for 6 or 7 years. And so I don't know how it'll end up, but to me it's a source of optimism, right? The law is holding someone accountable who needs to be held accountable.
You talked about the difficulty of the Fulton County case. One of the things she has are Republicans with whom Trump would have been very forthcoming. I mean, he says to Raffensperger, see to it to find me 11,780 votes. There's a call, there's all sorts of corroborating evidence. You've also got a slate of fake electors who've been told that some of them are targets of her investigation. What is less cut and dry as a prosecutor looks at that set of facts as they're publicly facing?
I worry that it's susceptible, again, the public things I've seen, I worry it's susceptible to a strong argument, I don't know whether it would win the day, but from the defense, that Donald Trump actually believed he had been defrauded of the election in Georgia. He knew he had lost by 11,000 and whatever votes, and so of course he said, I need to find that many votes, because he thought there were many more than that, members of the jury, but this is what he needed to be able to reverse this fraud he'd been the victim of. So he's not trying to find illegal votes, he's trying to remedy a fraud. And the fake electors thing, I'm sure there's people who believe that the fake, or will say they believe the fake electors thing was consistent with the Constitution, that the Chapman guy gave them.
Eastman.
Eastman, you can tell I don't follow this as closely as others do. That Eastman wrote a memo saying that this was consistent with the Constitution and a reasonable interpretation. So all of that will be available to them. And so I'm not saying it makes the case a dead loser, but that case strikes me as, again, all on the outside, closer than it may seem.
And what is the weakness then of all the people that told him none of that was true?
That a lot of people, I'm guessing, would be available to tell him that it was true. And yeah.
Yeah.
And his chaotic statements. And another part of Trump's maybe accidental genius is this doing it in broad daylight thing. Right? If I thought I was committing a crime, you think I would say it to the Secretary of State of Georgia on the frickin' telephone? You know what I mean? That argument is available to him. So I don't know how it'll end up, but that case makes me a little bit nervous.
Do you think it's important for him to be held accountable?
I do.
Criminally?
Yeah, I do. If the evidence is there, I think the most important thing about New York, in a way, is that it removes that risk aversion that prosecutors feel in doing the first of something. If the evidence is there, they ought to have the courage to bring the cases. Now, I don't know whether it's there in Georgia. I don't know whether it's there for Jack Smith.
When you look, again, just from the outside at all the cases into Trump, there's Alvin Bragg, there's Fani Willis, there's Jack Smith's twin probes, I'm sure there are more. Which do you assess as the strongest in terms of what's public?
Just from the outside, the documents case, and you know this much better than I as well, I've been intrigued by the little tidbits about the fundraising frauds. And so it's possible. I mean, Jack Smith seems...
Do you know him?
No. Seems to me to be acting like a pro, like Mueller did. There were no leaks out of Mueller's operation. There's no leaks out of this thing, near as I can tell. A lot of news, but I'm guessing it comes from lawyers representing witnesses and not from Jack Smith's operation. And so he may be doing something. I mean, I think everybody was surprised how much Mueller had done and just how much he laid out. Different levels of disappointment with where he ended up at the end of the day, but there may well be something that Jack Smith's working on, like this bit about did they fraudulently raise money and then misspend it, wire fraud, that would surprise people and be really, really strong. I don't know.
Do you think Mueller came up short?
I do. Yeah, I think Bob Mueller is a person of extraordinary integrity. So even if you disagree with him, you know he was trying to do what he thought right. I think in trying to accomplish a goal, he made things, which was to not accuse a sitting president of a crime. He both accused a sitting president of a crime, which was unfair to Donald Trump, and created tremendous confusion in the American people about what was there. And so I do think that was he either should have said nothing or made a recommendation of prosecution, in my view.
But I mean, wouldn't your critics say that, well, I guess with Hillary, your point is that the investigation was over and you were sharing new, I mean, how is that different from what happened to Hillary?
Well, I was very detailed in explaining why no charges are justified.
At a more mature point in an investigation?
Yeah, when we were done, fully done. And people forget this, but I spent that whole summer being just attacked in testimony along with the Attorney General and defending the work, saying, no, it's done. We are finished. Go away. We've done a great job, fair job. There's no case here. All of which sets up late October, the disaster to come. Yeah.
I want to get to some of the questions from the crowd, but I have one more book question about your heroine. But let's do this. This is a good one. What inspiration did you draw from other crime writers when writing this? Like, did you connect with anybody, or did you? No,
not really. I've read more since then. I've tried to read some of the greats since I wrote this, but I didn't. Part of it is I hadn't read much, and I thought if I start reading people, I don't want to start copying other people. And so I want to write stories the way that I write stories, and if it turns out to be like other people do, that it's a coincidence. And so I have not intentionally. I read a bunch of Le Carré, in part because I saw stuff about how Le Carré struggled to make his work interesting. And I think wrote in one of the forwards to one of his books that he didn't become commercially successful until he started making stuff up and making the spy business more exciting than it really was. And if you read his early stuff, it's a lot of at desks and back and forth with people. And it wasn't until he had spies trying to crawl over, the barbed wire topped Berlin Wall, which he says he was just totally making up, that it became commercially successful. And so I kind of took that as a challenge, because I thought, I want it to be the way it really is, because I think it's pretty darn exciting the way it really is, and readers will be the judge of that.
So this is for you. How do you weigh your constitutional duties to your moral compass?
Well, you think about all of it in trying to make hard decisions, and I call those the things above, your moral commitments, principles, the institution's values, obviously the Constitution and the laws that may govern what you do, and try most of all to be an actor within the institution that you lead. And I've been involved in situations where, not over this, but especially over torture, I had a lot of moral conflict over my institutional duties. And so the answer is, there isn't an easy way for me to prescribe how to do it, but you have to think about all of it while you're making a decision.
You just listening to you answer that question, I mean, what do you think when you see this new normal in America with the proliferation of access to guns? There was a mass shooting yesterday in Florida that didn't even make the news today. There's at least one day a week I rip up whatever I'm planning on covering, and I cover a mass shooting in America. And while I think it's rising on the list of things that people care about, I sometimes wonder why law enforcement isn't a more vocal participant in the conversation. If you talk to cops privately, they will all say that guns are everywhere.
Yeah, I don't know why a lot of cops are reticent to talk about it. I think it's that they don't want to get drawn into they've got enough to worry about without being drawn into a political fight over weapons. I don't have a good answer. One of the difficult things about being FBI director is that you get told about everything and shown everything. And so I've got in my head lots of images I can't get out.
Of victims?
Yeah, crime scenes and horrible things. And so I'm acutely aware of the damage from violence to children and others. Our challenge in America is we have more guns than people. And guns aren't like yogurt, right? There's no expiration date. And so we're going to have at least this many guns 20 years from now, even if we stop selling guns in America. And so I don't know whether our answer lies in the main in changing the way we regulate the sale of firearms, because we're still going to have the mother of all problems with violence. And so I don't have great answers. One of my frustrations as FBI director was there's a triangle formed by law enforcement, educational institutions, and healthcare professionals that is uneven across this country. And I often thought if we did a better job of sharing information there, we could save lives. But I'm a little depressed about this issue. I don't have a good answer. I think it's important to talk about the size of magazines to reduce the ability of someone to shoot without reloading. I don't get the fixation with long frame semi-automatic weapons, AR-15s and whatnot. But even if we solve all of those, we're still going to have 340 million non-AR-15s in this country. And so I don't want us to kid ourselves that an assault weapons ban is going to solve our problem. It's going to be a very long and painful run to try and reduce the scope of the carnage in this country.
Do you think that if more people saw what you've seen, that you could change the culture and come at it from another end? Like, do you think there's something wrong with the conversation around it?
I don't know, because I think people have attached this issue to their identity, and it's very, very hard to get people to change a view on some identity-based thing. I mean, look at Uvalde. Right? How can you look at that and say, you know what the answer is? Better police response. Or armed teachers. That's what we got to do. We got to arm teachers. But the people who are saying that, I mean, some of them are wingnuts and really bad people, but in the main, they're people who are saying it because they actually believe it. And they believe it because they've attached their identity to this issue, and it's really hard for human beings to get off of that. And so I'm really being depressing here, but this is our hardest problem.
Guns.
As a people, yes.
Is there anything about the debate and about the fact that the public isn't divided on guns? 85% of all Americans would like to see universal background checks. 79%, it's the highest since the assault weapons ban was lifted, would like to see a new assault weapons ban. 93% support red flag laws. In Tennessee, the majority of Tennesseans, Republicans, support gun safety legislation, that the Republican majority kicked 3 Democratic legislators out for trying to champion. I mean, do you have any hope in the fact that there's no persuasion to be done of the American public? 85 to 95% of all Americans agree we need gun safety laws.
Yeah, but they don't vote on it in a way that has consequences for the jobs of elected officials, or the way our country is polarized. It isn't susceptible to them kicking people out of office because of the red-blue gerrymandering. And so I don't see those polls translating into change. Now, I think I'm deeply optimistic about America. I think we're going to swing to a place that's a healthy, less polarized political environment. God willing, in my lifetime, I may have to live a long time. But in that environment, the healthier environment, there'll be more room for those incremental but really important changes around red flag and background checks and assault weapons. But I just don't see that happening now.
Sadly, I think you're right. Okay, back to the book. Will your next fiction book have a presidential election, I guess, as a plot? And how do you, will it?
No.
Why?
Well, maybe eventually.
Okay.
But my wife and I have talked about this, and her view is DC's too awful to write about right now. And so the next one is going to involve Nora Carlton. I've already written it.
Yeah.
And I worked for 3 years.
That's the female prosecutor.
Yeah, Nora. No, I worked for 3 years as the general counsel of the world's largest hedge fund, and so. Oh,
right. That's in the. Well, I don't want to give it away.
The next book, Nora is going to be in that world, and I want to show people in a fictionalized way that world in the context of a crime novel, and people who've read it so far said.
Now, you worked for Mr. Dalio. Are these experiences gained in the real world, or is this totally fiction?
It's totally fiction,
Of
Nicolle.
course, right. Okay. This is so smart. I'm sorry I didn't ask you before, but how do you respond to recent calls for the FBI to be disbanded and the politicization of the, what is it called, the weaponization of Jim Jordan thing, where they've had 3 really unhappy, I think they're former FBI agents. One didn't want to participate in an arrest of an insurrectionist, and I think the other 2 talked about politicization. What do you make of the right really coming out and wrapping both arms and legs around the politicization of the FBI?
Their hearings strike me as just more of the same. So remember Benghazi 1, Benghazi 2, Benghazi 3. So it's sort of like, I'm going to date myself, I can't believe that their base still goes for it. It's like Lucy and the football, that we're going to get them this time with this hearing. But it also is part of something that's really concerning, and that is that they feel free, and I felt this coming in 2013 and 14, they feel free to say things they know aren't true about the FBI because they see the FBI as a threat. It's become red meat to energize the base and raise funds, and that's just bad for our country. The FBI is flawed because it's made up of people, but it's a fundamentally good and honest place that makes mistakes, that's held accountable for its mistakes. But the notion that it's part of some evil deep state out to get Trump or something is just laughable and really bad. And I think you and I have talked about this. The FBI's problem is that it has no friends in high places. We spent 50 years in this country trying to make sure of that, because Hoover was having drinks with presidents, and Lyndon Johnson famously said, I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. Mm-hmm. And so let's keep J. Edgar. And J. Edgar, someone always had his back because of the deals he was making, the things he was doing. And after Hoover, the American people said, no, you will not be on anybody's team. 10-year symbolic term, so you stay away from those people. Why was I so freaked that Donald Trump wanted to have dinner with me alone? Because it violated that entire 50 years of that norm that's so central to the identity of the FBI. The cost of that is, when the stuff hits the fan, who's got the FBI's back? No politician really likes the FBI, because what does the FBI do? Makes cases against bad politicians. And so it's, in a way, the cost of the FBI's independence has been threats to the FBI itself. And I think the only way to solve that riddle is for more people who are not politicians to speak and talk and act on behalf of that institution. And we're, in fits and starts, it's being done, but the good news is the organization's going to be fine in the long run. It has an identity with the American people that is really strong. At the wingnut, edges, there are issues, but it'll be fine in the long run. Doesn't mean I'm not worried about the short-term damage.
Having once been a Republican, and it's hard to say what's craziest, but the 2 craziest things that the right is putting out there is that the U.S. military is woke and that the FBI is left. How do we get to this sort of post-reality, almost, if reality ends here and delusion starts here, they're over here in terms of smearing those agencies. Do you see it as something that's already had a dangerous impact?
Yeah. I mean, the power of an outrageous lie is that it's difficult to grapple with.
It's difficult to defend because it's so crazy.
Right, but it's so crazy, so I agree. It's so crazy, though, it carries indicia of reliability with certain audiences. right? I mean, the election was stolen in 2020? Who would say that if there wasn't something to it? Right?
Well, and who would steal it other than Trump?
So the FBI is a corrupt leftist organization. That's just nuts. But it resonates with people by virtue of, first of all, it's consistent with other lies they're consuming, but by virtue of its size. And there's no one to speak to that in a way, because how do you speak to that? Say no?
If you were FBI director, how would you have dealt with the question and the critique that if the January 6th insurrectionists had been black, they would have been shot and killed?
Well, first of all, I don't know as FBI director.
I'm just saying you were a leader in law enforcement. You would have had to field the question from your press corps. How would you have answered it?
I would say there's a reality to that. And part of it is the assessment. Yeah, there's a reality to that the assessment of people defending that hill was influenced by cultural and racial affinity. I think that's the truth. Now, I'm speaking with a broad brush about lots and lots of different officers, but there's some truth to that. That's what I would have said. And yeah, but I don't know where I go from there with that, honestly.
Well, isn't it a diagnosis of something we should be staring at, the way Trump once looked at the sun during an eclipse? I mean, isn't that the essence? Isn't that what we have to grapple with, right? That we're having this tortured conversation about whether Trump is so crazy he might actually have a criminal legal defense in January 6th because he believed the lady that talked to the wind and the guy that sells lumpy pillows. Isn't the reality that if those people were black men and women, they would have been shot and killed?
I think in large measure, yes. Again, it's a very complicated scene, but in the main, especially anybody who had displayed a weapon, there likely would have been violence. Now, the reason I'm hesitating is I think if a Capitol Police officer were here, they might say it didn't matter who was coming, we were so outnumbered. If we started using lethal force, no matter what the people looked like in front of us, we would have had a much bigger problem on our hands. And so that's why I pause a little bit. But you don't have
do you have any doubt that they would have been treated differently?
Yes, would have been treated differently.
And what do we do about that?
First, stare at it, say that it's a part of our reality. Law enforcement has to be honest. That's why I gave that speech that people got all worked up about law enforcement and race at Georgetown, that we have to be honest about the truths about law enforcement's interaction with communities of color. Because it's why I ordered all those courses to study our interaction with Dr. King when I was FBI director. I got all this hate mail from agents outside saying, you're hurting the FBI. And I say, every black man and woman we're trying to get to join the FBI knows this history. If we don't know it and stare at it and admit it and talk about it, how are we ever going to change and attract those people to work here? And so that's the first step, is acknowledging that this really exists. And it poses an enormous challenge to policing in communities of color and keeping people safe.
Do you ever read the papers or watch the news and wish you were trying to help the country solve these problems, these big problems that I know you've spent years and years and years thinking about?
Sometimes. And sometimes I look at it and think, first of all, I would have gotten fired eventually. I mean, I'm not saying that facetiously. We were too different. It was not going to work. And so I think it was inevitable. And so I console myself saying, you wouldn't be there anyway. It would have lasted another year or so, and that's probably irrational.
Like if Trump didn't get you, Bill Barr would have.
Yeah, and Trump was going to get me eventually. Just because again, maybe I would be thinking differently if the director before me had been fired, but I was a pain in the butt. And I thought that's what the American people, that's what all President Obama talked about with me when he interviewed me was, and he knew I had given money to McCain and to Romney. Now, I gave money to those people because I was worried unprincipled people might take over the Republican Party, a crazy thing to worry about. But he didn't.
You voted for Obama, right?
He didn't care. I don't never talk about who I voted for. No. But he said, I don't care about any of that stuff. I need you to protect the independence of that institution. That is what the American people are counting on you to do. And I said, yes, Mr. President, I will do that. And so I was going to get fired.
Did you vote in 2016?
No.
So you didn't make a choice?
No. And I thought I ought to. Not. And I tried really hard not to follow the political news, but of course I could feel it.
All right, I'm going to end with some questions about the book. I'm going to get back to the book. Maybe I'll start writing books again. Do you foresee reform in our justice system? Well, this is actually back to DOJ with regard to how painfully slow the wheels of justice turn.
I don't know. I really don't. And because a lot of our slowness is in part a reaction to the fatal flaw of mistakes in the criminal justice system.
It's by design.
Yeah, and so finding the balance is really hard.
So I don't think this is a spoiler, but which active SDNY judge was your character of your judge in the book based on? Was it a real?
I'm not saying.
I feel like this is like an inside question.
I don't want to give it away.
Okay.
That may not be about, right? Every Taylor Swift song is not about a real boyfriend. And
oh,
so,
yeah. Please.
And so I don't want to.
Yes, they are. Yes, we'll talk about that later. Oh, wow. This is super provocative. So good. It'll be the last question.
Stop.
Okay. In your calculation, who's done more harm to America, Donald Trump or Osama bin Laden?
Yeah, Osama bin Laden's responsible for the murder of 3,000 people in this city. So I can't compare those two. I mean, Donald Trump has done lasting damage to us that we really need to focus on. But bin Laden murdered, I don't have to tell a New York audience what Osama bin Laden did. So I wouldn't compare those.
I increasingly hear this question about terrorism. Do you think it's a fair conversation to have as a country about how we rumble with domestic terrorism and how we use the word and how we deal with it?
Yes. It's a big challenge for the Bureau in particular. I think the Bureau has the resources. White identity extremists are really easy to disrupt because most of them are just knuckleheads, right? Not real bright, multiple convictions, so they're easy to flip and penetrate with informants, but it requires focus to do it. And the Bureau has a cultural problem. Not that it has an affinity for these people, but this comes back to this risk aversion. They're worried about getting in trouble and getting hauled in front of Jim Jordan's committee or something and shouted at for pursuing First Amendment activities. And the Bureau has a long history of inappropriately investigating First Amendment activities, but a long time ago. And so they need the leadership to lean into that. It's easy to figure out when you're close to a First Amendment line and when someone has clearly crossed it. And so that cultural barrier has to be overcome with strong leadership. And if it's done, these groups can be disrupted pretty easily. I mean, Hoover crushed the Klan once he decided to focus on it. And the same can be done today.
And until further notice, you're going to be giving us your wisdom about the rule of law in America through your novels.
Yeah, and I hope they don't feel teachy, but you folks will learn a lot about how things work, I hope in a cool and entertaining way. And I'd like to continue to do that.
It's great. I read it about a year ago. I highly recommend it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be here with you and have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You're great. Okay.